Okay, so chapter 14, section 1 and 2, we're really looking at the expansion of industry and the age of the railroads. Um, Following the Civil War, the United States was largely a agricultural country. However, that begins to change, and it begins to change for a couple of reasons. One, the United States does have an abundance of natural resources. And again, it might not be resources we necessarily think of today, um, but at the time we had oil, black gold, as it was referred to. Now, oil had long been used by natives. Native tribes used it for fuel, medicine, long before Europeans would have arrived on the continent. However, um, it does not really evolve as a fuel source for the United States until a practical way of getting it out of the ground develops. And Edwin L. Drake is kind of responsible for that. In 1859, he creates a steam engine drill that allows oil to be extracted from the ground much more practically, and it really starts a boom in the oil industry, so to speak. Um, Oil, however, was not the only resource that the United States had. It also had an abundance of iron and coal deposits. Um, those iron and coal deposits could then be turned into steel, and that really started to the steel industry starts to take off with Henry Bessemer and his Bessemer process, which again allows the iron and the coal to be turned into steel much more efficiently, and it created um, a stronger steel. And then we're going to have growth in the steel industry um, as well as new uses for steel develop. Things like uh, the railroads used steel for the rail line. We also had steel cables being used for the Brooklyn Bridge. And probably the biggest, besides the railroad, the second biggest use for steel was these um, steel construction or steel interior of skyscrapers. So that's going to be a big driver for the need of steel. Government was also very supportive of business, and that this section really doesn't go into that. We'll look more at that in section 3 of chapter 14. But government is very supportive of business in general, which means that they're going to set conditions that are favorable for business to kind of grow. The United States also had a growing urban population that provided cheap labor. You had these urban populations, these urban centers, people needed jobs. They would often work for not a lot of money. The other thing that you need if your industry is going to expand is a market to sell those goods. And the United States also definitely had a market to sell those goods in these large urban areas. The inventions also start to promote change within the United States. In 1876, Thomas Alva Edison becomes a pioneer of sorts when he establishes the world's first research laboratory. He also perfects the incandescent light bulb. Um, and so in a relatively short period of time, you're talking about from 1876, 1880, those areas, to 1890, you're going to have more and more machines being run by electricity. Um, the inexpensive and convenient source of energy soon is going to become available in homes, which is then going to um, spur the innovation and creation of several time-saving appliances. We're going to have things like electric streetcars making urban travel cheaper and more efficient. It's also going to cause cities to grow outwards. Um, but more importantly, electricity is going to allow manufacturers to locate their plants wherever they want, not just near the source of power, which in the past would have been rivers. Um, Again, industry is able to grow because of this. You're going to have huge operations. Um, as electricity, the use of electricity grows, these operations become much larger. Um, Christopher Sholes invents the typewriter in 1867. Um, the typewriter and the telephone, which Alexander Graham Bell invents in 1876, um, really affected office work. It created new jobs for women. Um, Although, if you look at 1870, women made up about 5% of the workforce. By 1910, they're going to account for 40% of the workforce, mainly in these clerical jobs created by the typewriter and the telephone. Um, New inventions also had a powerful impact on factory work. Um, Again, with factories, you create machines that would do the work that men and women used to do. It freed some people from the backbreaking labor, and it helped improve to some extent the workers' standard of living. Um, Again, so we have some of these big inventions that are really promoting and changing the way people lived. However, at the same time, this can also be known as the age of railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad is responsible for kind of unifying the nation. It brings the nation together, um, but at the same time, it's also influenced many industries. Um, with the Transcontinental Railroad, many of the people that worked to build the railroad were your immigrants. They were oftentimes more of the poor immigrants. Um, Irish immigrants at time, Irish and Chinese made up the large portion of workers. Conditions, though, building the railroad were not the easiest. Most Many people died from disease, starvation, but also Native American attacks along the rail lines. So yes, there's some positives of the railroad coming in, but not at all the best time in making it. The railroads also provided for um, just some different opportunities. George M. Pullman was a manufacturer of streetcars, or sorry, not streetcars, rail cars. He created his own kind of town to create kind of a stable workforce for himself. Um, the problem with that is that he also required certain things of his employees. He was very much in control of their lives. So just kind of interesting things like that happen. The railroad itself was good things and bad things. The railroad was not above some scandals and abuses. The Credit Mobilier scandal involved basically setting up a shell corporation and then funneling profits through that and pocketing it. Um, the, the railroad oftentimes too um, they thought, or people thought, the railroads misused government land grants. They also fixed prices, which would keep farmers in debt. Um, in addition, they charged different customers different rates, often demanding more for short hauls, for which there was no other alternative carrier. So they kind of had monopoly over that uh, little chunk of transportation. And so farmers want to respond somehow. And in the last chapter, when we talked about populism, we talked about how farmers were very much against the railroad. Well, here's some of the things they started to do. They passed Granger laws, which basically were meant to regulate the um, the rates that railroads could charge farmers to ship their products. Um, the railroads fought back, and in the case of Munn versus Illinois, they actually lost. They lost the Granger movement. Basically, the Granger laws were upheld. Um, so some wins for farmers there. However, the Granger laws, that triumph was pretty short lived. In 1886, the Supreme Court's going to rule that a state could not set rates on interstate commerce, which is basically for railroads, anything that was coming or going from another state, a state couldn't regulate. So that gets farmers again kind of fired up. So in response, the United States government, the Congress passes the Interstate Commerce Act. This act was supposed to reestablish the right of the federal government to supervise railroad activities and established a committee to kind of supervise what was going on. But it kind of fails because there's just a very long legal process in trying to get that all figured out. And so really, it's not until 1906 that the ICC really has any type of power or any power that it would have needed to be overly effective. So ultimately, this kind of leads to some panic and consolidation that really leads to a kind of nationwide economic collapse in 1893. Basically, the Panic of 1893 turns out to be the worst depression that we'd had to the time. We have about 600 banks and 15,000 businesses that failed. By 1895, 4 million people had lost their jobs. And by 1894, the middle of 1894, a quarter of the nation's railroads had been taken over by financial companies. So again, it was not a great time with that. So the railroads, some abuses, and farmers kind of responded there to what was going on. So next section, we will be looking at big business, some of the things they did, as well as what labor did in response to big business.